When it comes to ESG, there are new regulatory reporting requirements coming into play for trustees from later this year. To discuss those, I'm joined now by Stuart O'Brien, partner at Sackers. Stuart, when it comes to statements of investment principles, I believe trustees are going to have to provide more details around ESG. When do they need to do that by? What does it cover?
Yeah, so last year, trustees had to update their statements of investment principles to include more detail on their policies on financially material ESG factors and their approach to engagement and voting. So that most schemes have already done that now. The changes that are due this year follow on from the UK's implementation of the Shareholder Rights Directive. And these require more detail to be included in statements of investment principles by 1st of October this year. So 1st of October 2020, trustees have got to put more information in their SIP. Now, there's no easement or extension on that for the COVID pandemic. That's that date is already in the that deadline is not going to move. So in terms of what's got to be covered, broadly speaking, what trustees have got to do is set out more detail on how their arrangements with their asset managers align with the trustees' policies. So last year it was all about the trustees stating their own policies on ESG and engagement. This year it's about putting more detail on how the trustees' arrangements with their asset managers align and implement those policies. Now, the wording's a bit clunky in the regulations, but it includes, just picking out a few of the headings here, it includes details on how asset managers are incentivized to align their investment strategy and decisions with the trustees' investment policies, including in relation to ESG. But it's important to stress it's not just alignment of manager policies on ESG with the trustees' policies, it is the whole approach. And all of the manager policies the trustees must describe how they make sure they align with the trustees. Trustees have also got to set out how their managers are incentivized to make decisions based on assessments of medium to long-term performance of the companies that the manager invests in. So that is trying to move us away from kind of short-term focus and looking more, as I say, more medium to long-term. Trustees have to describe how they incentivize their managers to do that. I think that one could be quite tricky to describe in a lot of detail for many schemes. And then also, and I'm not going to run through everything in the regs, but the other one that sort of stands out is trustees have also got to describe how their evaluation of their asset managers' performance and remuneration aligns with the trustees' policies. So again, it's that sort of sense of not just setting and forgetting a policy, but trustees will have to describe how they intend to monitor their managers to make sure that what's actually being done by the asset managers aligns with what the trustees set as their own policy. So as I say, in summary, it's going beyond last year's requirement to state trustee policies, and we now get a little bit more into the detail in terms of how those policies are carried through to managers and how trustees make sure that happens.
And trustees will also need to produce an annual report on the implementation of their policies. What exactly are the requirements here?
Yeah, there's been quite a bit of confusion around these, what are going to be known as implementation statements. The confusion stems from the regulations being worded in quite a difficult way, or quite not an obvious way. So that's led to a bit of confusion around the timing requirement and the content. So on timing, taking a step back from the complexity of the regs, what it boils down to is the first report and accounts that pension trustees produce after 1st of October this year, they're going to need to include an implementation statement. Now, report and accounts, the timing of those will vary for each scheme, but the statutory obligation is to produce those within 7 months of a scheme year end. So if you take a scheme that has a scheme year running from 1st of January to 31st of December, that means the first report and accounts produced after October this year is likely to be in July next year. So your scheme year runs 1 January 2020 to 31st December 2020. By July 2021, there's a statutory obligation to produce your report and accounts, and you will need to include an implementation statement in that. Things get a bit trickier if you run your scheme year from 1st of April to 31st of March. For those, if you take the full 7 months from the end of March to produce your report and accounts, that means you would be doing your implementations. You'd have to do your implementation statement this year, i.e. in October 2020. But if you get your report and accounts done a little bit earlier this year, i.e. before 1st of October, then you can essentially defer the obligation to produce an implementation statement. So I think the key message here is trustees need to take advice. They need to make sure they've taken advice on the timing as it applies to their specific scheme year. But there are traps for the unwary, so one to look out for. The content is similarly has led to a bit of confusion. Broadly speaking, the requirement for DB schemes is to produce an implementation statement just on engagement and voting. So how your managers or how the trustees have implemented their engagement and voting strategy over the prior scheme year. For DC schemes, the implementation statement requirement is broader. It's to describe how you've implemented all of your policies in your SIP. So a more comprehensive implementation statement for DC schemes. Now, there's another trap here. If your scheme provides DB and DC benefits, so you're a hybrid scheme, then you're caught by the DC requirement. So you have to describe how you've implemented all of your policies across the whole scheme, both DB and DC section. Now, the get out, if you're a DB scheme and the only DC benefits you provide are just AVCs, but so in that, if that's your only DC benefit, then you've got the DB regime, which is just reporting on your voting and engagement. But everyone else, it's reporting on implementation of all your policies across the whole prior scheme year. So as I say, trustees, take care on the timing, take care on the content, and get advice specific to your scheme.
Well, if you are a trustee of a hybrid or a DC scheme, and it sounds as if there's a much broader range that you have to report on, what should you be thinking about? Are there key areas you should focus on?
Yeah, as I say, and as you've sort of captured there, the regulatory requirement is to report on how the trustees have implemented all of their policies in their statement of investment principles. So that is quite a broad requirement. You could write a lot of material on what the trustees have and haven't done in terms of every aspect of their SIP. I think there's very little guidance at this stage in terms of what trustees should be including. The regulations are pretty broad, so I think what we would suggest, and I think what schemes will start to do as they tackle these for the first time, is to prioritise. So pick out the features of the statement of investment, their statement of investment principles, and the trustee policies that merit annual reporting. So I think we're going to see a lot of trustees focusing on their ESG policies because they are new, their engagement and voting because that is something that must be included. So my expectation is that the implementation statements that trustees will produce will be focusing on how the trustees have implemented their policies on environmental, social and governance factors. Now, there might be some other commentary that trustees seek to include on how they've dealt with other risk issues. And at the moment, I could see that the first batch of implementation statements might include some commentary on what has happened to the trustees' expectations of returns and how the scheme's asset portfolio has been impacted by the COVID pandemic. But as I say, I think in terms of some sort of level of prioritisation, I think is going to be the way to go on this.
For some schemes, the first report might be a little way off. But is there a thing, even if that's the case, are there things that trustees should be doing now?
Yeah, so sort of taking us back to that earlier question on timing. Yes, you're right. For some schemes, particularly those that run a calendar year, they might not be doing this, might not be writing this up until sometime in the spring or summer of 2021. However, your reporting period is over the prior scheme year. So the clock has already started ticking for pretty much all schemes in terms of what they're actually having to report. So I think to make sure that trustees don't end up having to produce an implementation statement with a lack of data, the conversation needs to start now between trustees and their managers and their advisors. So I think the first step to prepare is work out what you've got to do and when. So that timing point, as I say, is all important. So when do you have to produce your first implementation statement? And are you a DB, DC scheme? What's the content requirement? The second thing is to speak to the investment advisors and the asset managers to make clear what the reporting expectations are of the trustees. So to make sure that that data is flowing through on engagement and voting practices from the managers to the trustees, so that when the trustees have to do their first implementation statement, they've got the material at their fingertips to write this up. They don't have to go scrabbling back and work out what managers might have done over a period, up to a year or more ago. So I think it's that early conversation with managers now to make the trustees' expectations clear.
Well, we talked through implementation statements and statements of investment principles. Anything else on the horizon that trustees should be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, nothing stands still on ESG. There's a few things coming down the track as well as implementation statements. I think rightly trustees will be focusing on this at the moment, and we know lots are. But many will have spotted the pension schemes bill that was going through Parliament earlier this year. Some amendments government-backed amendments proposed to that, which we fully expect to be included in the final version of the Act. And they provide a regulatory making power for the government to mandate climate risk reporting. Now, it remains to be seen how that comes through in terms of final regulations. At the moment, as I say, it's just an enabling power in the bill. But my expectation here is that the government will produce regulations requiring TCFD reporting from larger schemes first, probably in line with the Green Finance Strategy that was published last year, which suggested large asset owner reporting or TCFD style reporting by 2022. So I think that's one to watch. We haven't seen any regulations yet, but when they come out, it will be interesting to see which schemes are going to be caught first, and what they're expected to do. But I think if you're a larger scheme, you should be looking at TCFD recommended disclosures sooner rather than later to get ahead of those regulatory changes. And then on top of that, so as I say, there's a lot happening. There is more coming through from Europe as well. This is probably still at a slightly earlier stage, but there's a joint consultation out at the moment on ESG disclosures, and there are some draft regulatory technical standards in terms of what might be required under EU regulations on sustainability-related disclosures for the financial services sector. Now, this goes more broad than pension schemes, but there's every reason to think that pension schemes as participants in the financial services sector will have similar technical reporting requirements imposed on them. So, a way to go on that, and obviously it's Brexit dependent too, but I think that's something to keep an eye on.
We have to leave it there. Stuart O'Brien, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.